Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Open Air presented by the Harvey B. Gantt Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm Dexter Wimberly, and I'm absolutely thrilled about today's guest. Christoper Myers is a Brooklyn-based artist and writer who works across disciplines and is rooted in storytelling. Myers delves into the past to build narratives that speak to the slippages between history and mythology. His diverse practice spans textiles, performance, film, and sculptural objects, often created in collaboration with artisans from around the globe. Christoper has worked around the world with traditional shadow puppet makers in Jakarta, conceptual video artists in Ho Chi Minh City, young musicians in New Orleans, woodcrafters in Accra, weavers in Luxor, textile printers in Copenhagen, and more. His work has been exhibited internationally, including at MoMA PS1, the Art Institute of Chicago, Kigali Genocide Memorial Center in Rwanda, Sen Art Ho Chi Minh City, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. His work is included in the permanent collections of institutions including the National Gallery of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, the Guggenheim Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and the Los Angeles County Museum, among others. I'd like you to join me in welcoming Christoper Myers to today's open air conversation.
Is that those kind of narratives are what frames and kind of sculpts our interaction with the world. Stories are the technology that uh, interpolates our selfhood with the kind of larger context of the globe. And so I'm interested in all the kinds of storytelling, and that's something that has been a passion of mine since I grew up in that context. So wherever I go in the world, I find storytellers, and they may not be traditional storytellers. They may not be like in Jogja. There's this like long tradition of shadow puppet makers and theater makers, and those are a kind of storytelling. But even when you talk to craftspeople, like there's stained glass window makers that I work with in Mexico, they're also storytellers. You know, they see themselves as craftspeople, but they are at their center, they are telling stories in their work. And I believe in that. I believe in that, as a practice, as a kind of a spiritual practice, and as a kind of an orientation toward the world. I think that we are sorely in need of recognizing that we live in a fabric of storytellers. No matter where we are, no matter who we are always processing the world through the stories that we are told and that we are telling.
No, thank you, thank you. There's so many things I want to get into that relate to what you just described. I mean, the first thing is that so your work spans multiple disciplines, including textiles, performance, film, and sculptural objects, right? And how do you decide which medium to use for a particular story or concept? Like speaking of
Right.
stories, like what is that process like for you?
So at one point in my life, I was big on the idea that the medium should match the message, that somehow there was some kind of natural affinity for one kind of medium with a story. So for example, when I did a series on kind of alternative saints, I did that in stained glass because it relates to the kind of Catholic Church, what the idea of making saints lives in stained glass. But as I've gotten older, I've come to the conclusion that in the end, we are only telling 4 or 5 stories over and over and over again. And so it's important to tell them in lots of different formats. So I think that less and less I'm married to the idea of telling a story once, and I'm more interested in the idea that we should tell stories again and again. We should refine those stories, and we should find the ways in which each format informs us in a new way about those stories that we have heard 1,000 times. So when I do something as a massive tapestry or a quilt, it has an intimacy to it. It has a certain kind of closeness to it. There's a way in which when we look at fabric, when we look at work with that's made with fabric, we always feel that it's as close as a bed sheet. And there is a beauty to that closeness. And at the same time, if I do something in stained glass or if I design an opera, there is also a beauty in the remove. There's a beauty in the kind of uh, stentorian tones that stained glass can bring, right? So when something is so much bigger than you, there's a great beauty in that as well. And so I think that it's important to have both. It's important to have the intimacy, and it's important to have the overblown bombast of an opera, let's say. And for us to kind of bridge gaps, to say that even our smallest moments, even our most intimate moments, could be worthy of an opera. I think that's part of what I'm thinking through, part of what I've been working with, part of what I've been trying to do is to bridge those gaps by telling these stories again and again in different formats.
Well, you mentioned opera, so you can't mention opera and we just move on from that. We gotta kind of unpack that a little bit. For those who aren't familiar with the work that you've done that incorporates opera, can you talk about like what that process is like, what it's been like for you, and
Right.
and also it kind of connects to the broader idea of collaboration. So much of your work is about
Yes.
collaboration. So speaking about collaboration, but let's start with like working with opera companies or what that looks like for you.
Right. So I was making a lot of theater, and then at some point I was invited to design an opera. The first opera that I designed is called Omar. It was written by Rhiannon Giddens and Michael Abels, and it was directed by Kaneza Shawl. And my job was to kind of be the production designer, to think, um, what is the visual landscape of this opera. Now, this opera was a hard one. It was based on the autobiography of a man who was enslaved in the 1830s, who came to the United States educated already. So he had been educated in Arabic, he wrote in Arabic, and when he found himself in this worst of circumstances, he turned toward his faith, he turned toward the practice of writing and his education. And that made him remarkable, especially at a time in which we were outlawed from reading, outlawed from literacy. Um, Here is this brother that was finding his way through hell on the back of his pen, and so that was the kind of the landscape that I was thrust into as a designer, to think about how do you talk about all of that, um, in a visual, how do we build a visual landscape that holds all of that. So what I ended up doing with this was, because we have his handwriting, because his journals are in the Library of Congress, and because I'm at center a library person, because I love stories to such an extent. I went to the Library of Congress. I got images of his text, of his actual handwriting, and every scene in that theater piece, every scene in that opera was outlined by his writing. The edges of the world that we were defining were defined by his literacy, by his perspective, by his actual handwriting. And I thought that that was a gift that I could give to the story. The idea that, here is this person for whom literacy itself was taboo, but we get to take that and refigure that. We get to take that and bring him and his perspective to the center, to say this is the legacy that we want to perpetuate. We want to perpetuate the fact that this man told his story in the 1830s. He wrote it in Arabic, and we could define every stitch of fabric, every costume in that production was built around his handwriting. So this is the kind of work that I do, that is, in the end, I mean, it's a collaboration that is absolutely a collaboration with the director. It's absolutely a collaboration with the composer and librettists. Um, but it's also a collaboration with Omar ibn Said, this brother from the 1830s. And, we as a person who is fiercely and loudly committed to storytelling, I understand that stories cannot happen in a vacuum. You need a storyteller, you need listeners. You don't, if you're just sitting there talking to yourself, you're not telling a story. You're just, I guess, performing a monologue you're whispering to clouds or something like that. Um, and I'm interested in that as a kind of collaboration. This collaboration that spans generations, that spans hundreds of years, many histories. And even when it gets to like my fine arts work, I'm always thinking in that term. I'm thinking in the idea that I want to be part of traditions. I come from traditions. I want to plug into traditions. There is some sector of the art world that likes to imagine itself to have invented themselves. What they say, sprung from the brow of Zeus like Athena, fully formed. We don't invent ourselves. We come from traditions. We come from histories, and I'm always interested in engaging with those histories.
That's brilliant, brilliant. So your current exhibition on view at the Harvey B. Gantt Center is titled "Please Trouble Carry Me," and it explores the relationship between Black bodies, the diaspora, and water. Can you talk a little bit about those themes and how they're intertwined in your work, Black bodies, the diaspora, and why is water such an
Right.
attractive element?
Well, particularly, I've been interested. I come from a literary world, and I'll tell you a strange thing. I'm interested in the hyphen, right? That hyphen between African and American. That that is like a revolutionary moment that happened when we got that hyphen. And what I mean by that is that we both there is nothing more American than us in certain ways, right? We are, upon our backs, upon the sweat of our brows is this country built, right? And then at the same time, there is nothing more American than our inside and outside status. The idea that we like both belong and don't belong. There's always this hyphen that we live on, that the first African Americans are built not on the continent, not on the shores of South Carolina, not in Jamestown, but they're built on that ocean in between, on that moment of hyphenate identity, that moment in which we like lose something of our past but gain something of a future. There's all of that. That hyphen is really important, and so I'm interested in that hyphen. I'm interested in the kind of in-betweenness of us, and the ways in which we then proceed to teach the world how to live in between, because the world all heads this way, right? Everyone becomes hyphenate after we exist. All of a sudden there become, every time when you think about, what does it mean to be Indian American, or what does it mean to be, Afro Danish, or anything of this kind of like world in motion, this idea that we live on a spinning planet, that in which we are both defined by where we are, but we're also defined by where we have come from, and we are also defined by what we dream toward, right? So all of that kind of vector thinking, it's not placed, we're not geographically sited, we live on the vector, we live on that movement. And I'm constantly like thrilled and excited to engage in that kind of storytelling, to think about all of the ways in which we have innovated on that hyphen, we have lived on that hyphen, we have been this kind of hybrid culture that has pointed the way for the rest of the world. So you can see it in the pieces, you can see it in different ways. So there's this very direct relationship to water, that when you hear the stories of, let's say, Igbo landing, in which a bunch of folks got off the boat, turned around, walked back into the water, choosing death over becoming the kind of tools of capitalism that they wanted our bodies to be. That's there's a brilliance and a bravery in that I'm fascinated with. And there's this relationship to water there. But then there's also the in between worldsness of baptism as an idea, that too becomes, we think of crossing. Years and years ago, I used to work as a history researcher, and you write long emails and letters to people who know things more than you do. And one time, a woman from New Orleans wrote me back, and she used an old phrase when she wrote me back. She asked, "Are you from across the water?" And she was asking if I was black. And I did. It's like an old school like thing that I did not know. I had to ask my pop. I was like, "Pop, what's this woman mean?" And we looked at it together. He's from New York. We were both, and he's like, "Oh, this is what she's asking." And that idea of like, we're from across the water, not that we have some mythical home, but that we are made in the idea that we crossed the water. That's how we became. So there's all of these relationships to water. Then there's also all these relationships to dreaming, to liminal spaces. So there's this large quilt that's about a film that I love, 1972, Tuki Buki. It's a Senegalese film, by Jibril Diop Membeti, and it's about these young couple that is dreaming of going to Paris, and so they try to smuggle themselves aboard a ship leaving from Dakar to Paris. And it's interesting because, like so many of the migrants that I've worked with over the years, I've done a lot of work in migrant camps and refugee camps. These kids had never been to Paris, but Paris was a part of their imagination, right? So the vector that they imagined themselves in the future was from Dakar to Paris, right? They imagined themselves in their dreaming to be in another place. That hyphen happens in the liminal space of dreaming. Water is a liminal space. All of these kind of mythology is a liminal space that allows us to imagine ourselves in another place. And so all of that for me kind of figures into this body of work, that is thinking about the idea that we live on the hyphen, but we then make new hyphens for ourselves. We dream ourselves into new worlds all the time.
So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what it's like to work in some of these locations that you've mentioned, particularly the migrant camps and the refugee camps, because
Mhm.
I would I would guess that most people have never sort of had the opportunity to talk to people in those circumstances and what that looks like. And so maybe you can just kind of share a little bit about that because you'll be going into these spaces as an artist, as an outsider, as someone who arguably, people might be suspicious of like your motives and your
Right.
intentions and like what you're doing. And how do you navigate that?
Right. Well, I'll tell you a few things. I mean, I'll tell you about two camps, or two situations, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how I navigate those places. So, the first thing I will tell you is that, and I think that you understand this, Dexter, personally. Like, being black is an amazing passport. It allows a certain kind of freedom in travel. Like, there are ways, of course, that there are moments and there are times that are absolutely challenging, but for so much of the world, being black is a moment of there's a moment of recognition, and there's also a moment of understanding what side of history you're on. So, when I used to split time for years between New York and Vietnam, in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and the understanding that I got from the majority of Vietnamese folks was, oh, you fought those people? We fought them too. Right? There was an idea that, like, as African Americans, we had been also subject to some of the colonial impulses that had affected them and the world, and the entirety of the world, right? Which is interesting to me. I mean, some of my uncles had fought in Vietnam, but there was an understanding that they had that we were all part of being on one side of this kind of colonial divide. And I found that that has been true over and over and over again in the world. There's a way in which, although I am absolutely a foreigner and a stranger, there's a sense that they're like that people have of like, you're a foreigner and a stranger, but you're not here to come and take from us, because that
Mm,
is not something that that being black announces. It does not announce that you're coming to take from us. So, um, when I was with a bunch of kids in Munich. I went to Munich in 2016. At that time, there were maybe 30,000 people a day coming into Munich because there was an asylum system in place. And there were several conflicts going on in the world. So I was dealing with kids from, and I brought together a group of children, unaccompanied minors. I have some connections there, and I said, look, can I bring some young people here every day and just work with them? Because I knew that, you know, as with any of us who've ever been in any kind of desperate situation, be it poverty or other kinds of like desperate situations, there's also a level of kind of not being able to do anything that comes with that.
mm,
Something I always write about is the idea of like the boredom of poverty. Like the idea
mm,
that when you don't have money, there's not a lot to do. And so I knew that that was going to be a thing that was going on with these young unaccompanied minors who had come from the mouths of hell to find some kind of world for themselves in Munich. And so I invited them, and they came as like studiously every day for about a month and a half. I was with some kids who were ages 9 to about 18, who had come from Iraq and Afghanistan and Mali and Nigeria and Eritrea. All these kids had found themselves there, had dreamed themselves into this world that they could not have imagined. And in that moment, there's always a question of like, well, what do you want from me? Because these are kids who have like smuggled themselves through forests at night and like set themselves on the Mediterranean in inflatable rafts. And I think that there was something clear for them about the mythology that surrounds us as African Americans, that we are not here to take something from them, and they all wanted to like share with me that they knew something of our culture, which I thought was also brilliant and interesting. Everyone wanted to like sing whatever, like we are this, as a people, we are exporting culture rapidly, right? And so they want to sing to you whatever song they've heard. They want you to know that they have seen you somehow, just because they also want to know that they have been seen, right? Because that's the other part of their desperate situation, is that there's an invisibility that is forced on a migrant kid like that, on that kid who is being introduced to the hyphen of his life for the first time, or the hyphen of her life. She was an Iraqi all her life, and now all of a sudden she has to choose to be German Iraqi, or what is that life going to be? And I think that there is, at a very core level, although a 9-year-old is not going to be able to articulate this, an understanding of that hyphenateness, and that there is something there for her in the world to understand oneself in a hyphenate way. So that is what I got from those kids. And those kids, I'm still in touch with some of them. They've had to go and build the life for themselves. But I felt like, as an artist, one of my jobs was to think about the idea of what does it mean to imagine a life for yourself, because that's another thing that you don't know that you can do until someone helps you do it, right? Until someone says to you, like, your imagination is the limit for what you can bring to your own life, and so that was part of what I was trying to do, was just kind of imagine with these kids, to think about what does it look like to live after the desperation. And I'll tell you, on the other hand, that I can tell you a story in which I would not say this is about failure, but it's about an understanding that there are limits to even that kind of imagination. I was in the what's, I think, currently the world's largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and there's about 1 million Rohingya refugees there. The Rohingya are people from Myanmar, Muslim minority, that have been kind of just forced into the ocean at a certain point. And there, you were seeing stories of boats floating around the Bay of Bengal for years and years, hoping to like find a safe port. And Bangladesh is one of the places where they can land. Um, and it was wild to be in a place where these folks had not ever imagined that they would be hyphenated, right?
Mm.
They had lived in Myanmar for generations. So there was no like quick movement to the next kind of life that they were going to build. They were still thinking about that they could go back to Myanmar, what to do. There's no structure around their forced migration, and that is fascinating, and then in those moments I do feel like there is also a love that we can give them, in terms of what does it mean to be put into a life in which there's no structure to your forced migration. I think that we're kind of pioneers in that. We got 400 years under our belt. So
Wow, wow. It's interesting. You talked about the experience of being an African American and traveling to some of these places, and it's certainly something I can relate to, both professionally with the curatorial work that I do and the travel that involves, but then also personally. I moved to Japan 3 years ago and have sort of had to figure out my way through navigating a different culture, and all that entails in terms of expectations, and also information, misinformation, all of those things.
yeah,
I decided, just to just go with it, because I think that when you find yourself in a foreign environment, by choice, right? So it's very different by choice,
right.
right?
Amen. Yeah.
then if you're making the choice, then I think some responsibility comes along with that. But I couldn't possibly imagine what it would be like to be here without a choice,
Right.
and yearning for and pining for, a return to someplace else.
Right.
Just that, that's like an interesting thought to think about, well, to consider rather. And then, you also talked about how the reaction that certain people have had, to you, sort of like, oh, you fought those people too. That kind of makes me think about the fear of solidarity that was around in the 60s and 70s, in the US, sort of like, the sort of like the quote unquote anti-communist movements and all of that. It's like, oh,
Absolutely.
we don't want Black Americans to be aligning themselves with other, peoples around the world who are similarly kind of affected by colonialism, affected by capitalism in those ways. It's really, really fascinating. Can you share a little bit about, like, how you've negotiated working with other cultures within the context of like your artwork, in the sense that I know that just from what I know of you and know of your work, that you have a very keen sense of respect and also understanding of how to work within other cultures and other structures. But I also know that there's some people who would be concerned about, appropriation, or sort of
Mm-mm-mm.
like, what does it mean to, for example, go into, and this is just something I'm making up, but what does it mean, for example, to go into a small village in China or in Vietnam and then work with local artisans, but then bring that work into a contemporary art
Right.
context?
Right. Well, I mean, you bring up so many things, and that's part of why I like talking to you, Dexter, because there's always like the conversations are. I always feel like our conversations are incomplete because I feel like I want to talk more about these things. This idea, this moment of the fear in the late '60s, especially about like our solidarity with the global South, is fascinating to me, and I spent some time in Bandung, where they had the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, which was this like radical moment. I also spent some time in Slovenia recently, where that was also like a non Yugoslavia at that point was a non-aligned nation, and so you'd see all of these like Afro-Slovenian folks because they were from that time period in which people were traveling to Yugoslavia to be educated because they understood that Yugoslavia wasn't going to play the kind of Western powers game or whatever version of the game. And I'm interested in all of those histories and kind of unpacking all of those histories. In terms of my own kind of very personal reaction in relation to making work with all of the kind of people that I encounter, I'll tell you a few stories. One story is just the idea that uh, the idea of an individual artist who works alone is such a Western idea. It's so narrow in a certain kind of way. So when you work in with the traditional shadow puppet makers, and I'm working with people who are like 4 or 5 generations deep of shadow puppet making, right? This is a tradition in their culture that they have been dealing with. The first thing that's interesting is that there is no one shadow puppet maker. There's a guy who makes the sticks. There's a guy who carves the leather. There's a guy who paints the leather. There's a guy who attaches the leather, right? So all of these guys are 4 or 5 generations of one very specific way of making a thing. And they are in conversation with me as a guy who like does some drawings, right? And there's something that's really beautiful about transcending all of the kind of cultural difference and getting down to a kind of a craftsmanship, and that too is a culture and a language that we share, right? There are
Mm.
moments that we share that culture and we share that language. People respect that I draw, so I do a lot of drawing in front of people, right? I do a lot of sitting with people saying, I'm not just a guy coming in here out of the blue, um, who's asking you to give me something. I'm also like sharing with you things. I'll tell you one of like my little moments of pride for me, a feather in my cap, is when you see somebody who's been doing something for 5 generations and they're excited by a design that you do, and then they take that. And so like there's some shadow puppets in the world that clearly I have some Chris influence, and I'm so excited by that. I'm thrilled by that. Um, so that's one thing that I think about. The other thing that I think about is about roles. So I in one of my other lives, I have an imprint at Random House, and I publish books. I've made books for young people my whole life, and I still do, and I love that. It's a different kind of storytelling that has a very different kind of audience and effect, and I think it's important. That being said, when I was with those kids in Munich, I said to one of these kids, Abdullah, I said, Abdullah, you've come from Syria. Your world has kind of like fallen apart. But I wonder if it would be important for you to tell this story. I wonder if it would be important for you to share this in a different kind of way. And Abdullah looked at me with the kind of swagger and snottiness that only a 16-year-old boy can have. And he said to me, he said, Chris, do you have dentists in your country? And I said, yeah, I do. We do. He's like, well, you say to me, he says, you say to me that I know my story better than anyone else, and therefore maybe I should tell the story. And I said, yeah, I believe that. He goes, okay, you've got teeth in your mouth. I was like, yes. He's like, you know your teeth probably better than anybody else knows your teeth, right? I was like, yeah. He's like, but if something goes wrong with your mouth, you need to go to a dentist, right? And I was like, yeah. He's like, that's the dentist's job, is to take care of your teeth. You're a storyteller. That's your job, Chris Myers. And this snotty 16-year-old boy taught me something in that, which is the idea that like we are craftspeople. That's our job. And my job is to tell stories, and to tell stories to the best of my ability. It's Appropriation is absolutely a thing that happens in this world. You don't need to take the story from another storyteller, but also understand that you are a storyteller and that you bring yourself to that story. If you bring yourself to that story with the kind of the depth and the care that you are able to yield, it will not be appropriative, because you will have brought yourself to it. And that's the other thing, is I don't go to any of these places in the world and hide who I am. This is me bringing myself to it, bringing myself to collaboration with artists with whom I share so much, who I respect, and who also come from traditions in which this idea of you know the individual artist who does everything is a rare idea. And they're waiting for someone to bring them designs, because sure enough, if you go to some places in Central Egypt right now, you'll see some things that are related to what I do, and that's a beautiful thing too, and I love that. So
Well, no, that's fantastic. I want to share some images. We do have a few images of your work, and that would be a great way for us to kind of put some color and context into some of the things you've mentioned. So we have the titles here. So maybe you can just share a little bit about each work. I mean, obviously we don't have a sense of scale here, so that might also be something worth mentioning. And
right.
take a minute and just share what you'd
I
like
got you.
about
I
this
got
particular.
you. So one of the things that happens, I feel like, with all the artists nowadays, all of us, everybody wants to make films. Have you noticed that? Where everybody's like, Titus
Yeah,
made a film, and everyone's
yeah.
and Rashid made a film. Everyone trying to make a film. And I was interested in the idea of like, could I make a film that was still just my work? So this is an attempt to kind of address some of my own filmic fantasies and love. This is based on that film I mentioned earlier, Tuki Buki by Jibril Diop Membeti from 1972. And it's about the size of a movie screen. So it's about 25 feet by 10 feet. Um, and it's me thinking through the themes of this film and kind of sharing my love of the story and seeing the ways in which I overlap with this story, the ways that I feel that my own story intersects with this one. So this is what Tukibuki is. Again, it's this idea that our dreams are another space we imagine ourselves into. So just as we can imagine a past, we can imagine a future, and this is all of those kind of futures are ahead of us. And I'm interested in that kind of thing. And I'm also interested in breaking down the language, the fine arts language, that suggests that certain styles of drawing, certain styles of making are more or less conceptually rooted than others. That's something I'm interested in a lot, is that, I love craft. I love old kinds of craft, but I don't see them as somehow less intellectually rigorous. And I think that that's something that's important. I think that we often associate intellectual rigor in the visual arts with um, with with like digital collage, digital means of production, um, collage and photography, language as an element. We associate that with the kind of the conceptual rooting of artwork. And I'm like, we need to look at the quilts of Gee's Bend with the same kind of subtle nuance that we look at Matisse, and they're both contemporaries of each other, right? We need to look at the kind of conceptual rooting of, when I'm back to the quilts of Gee's Bend, which I think are some of like the most remarkable works of our time. When you look at what they call a death quilt, where they take someone's clothes that has passed away and they make it into a quilt, if that's not the most Sophie Calle, like Louise Bourgeois, like beautiful conceptual intervention, I don't know what it is. And I think that we don't sometimes look at those Black women from that time period with the same kind of conceptual rigor that we ought to. And so I'm always interested in making work that uses the language of kind of folk art, but still brings the kind of conceptual rigor that I'm interested in. So that's what I got on this one.
Yeah, yeah. I have some follow-on questions, but let's go to the next
I
image
got
in the
you.
interest of time.
Yeah,
And so, can you share a bit about this work, and then I have a couple of follow-on questions.
you bet. So this piece has been about my own kind of obsession with soap recently. So most of the soap that you get um, to this very day is based in palm oil. Palm oil is farmed in Indonesia and West Africa. The origins of palm oil, the palm oil trade, they happen in Congo, Belgian Congo, back in the day, and um, it's all this. The palm trees produce an oil from which we make all of our soap. The the biggest palm oil importer at that time was a man named William Lever. And anytime you use a Unilever product, and that Unilever product is pretty much everything, real talk, it's everything. Like, it's Ben and Jerry's, it's Vaseline, right? Unilever is everywhere. You are engaging in this long history of how this product came to be, which was on the backs of this massive plantation in the middle of the continent. Um, all of us, all of our bodies, all of the kind of horrors of King Leopold relate to this idea that for all of our soap and cleanliness is next to godliness, it comes from these stories, these bodies. So there was, they called a part of it that's now called Lusanga, they called it Leverville after this man, William Lever. So I'm interested in the ways in which we are always and ever relating to the entire globe. No matter what we do, we are always and ever part of this longer narrative. Every time you wash your hands, you relate to King Leopold. Every time you eat a pint of Ben and Jerry's, there you are in the long history of what Unilever and William Lever did to the continent. And I'm not saying this because I'm an advocate of some kind of like massive boycott, because I'm really not, because I also know that there is no thing that I can touch that doesn't touch the rest of the world. That's who we are. That's how the world is built. Any idea that we can live without that hyphen is a myth. And this is what this piece is about. It's about specifically the palm oil trade in West Africa.
It's truly amazing story, and really does connect to something I'm personally passionate about, and that is looking at history through the lens of through the lens of parallels.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say that, what I mean more specifically is that when I think about the history of a country or an individual's history, as one is taught that through an education system, it's often done isolated from other things that were going on in the world at the very same time.
Right.
So for example, um, it's very fascinating when you. I mean, this is not the best example, but it's
Hmm.
somewhat fascinating when you see a photograph of two very, very well-known people whose stories are often not told together, and you see them together in a photo, and then it's sort of like you go, "Oh yeah, they were alive at
Right.
the same time." Right? That totally makes sense, right?
Right.
Um,
And knew each other and had a relationship with each other of some sort,
I had
even
that.
if it was
Yeah,
tangential. Right.
yeah, I had that experience when I was a kid. When I first time I saw, and this might be silly, but it was like the first time I saw a photograph of like you know Muhammad Ali and like Malcolm X standing next to each other. It was
Yeah.
like, of course they knew, and this is me as a kid, but it's like,
Right.
of course
Right.
they knew each other. But when
Of
I
course.
was taught about Malcolm X in school, it was very, very narrow, very sort of like only about a very specific aspect of his life. Or when you see someone, a very famous person from the U.S. in a photograph with someone from, Italy or France, both on vacation somewhere, and you're like, oh yeah, this was a full person. They also went on vacation, right? They didn't
Right.
just they
Right.
didn't just like march all the time. They also did
Right.
other things. And so as this relates to the story you're telling about palm oil and Unilever and all of these things, the interconnectedness of all histories and all lives is something that I think really sort of informs your work and is fascinating to me. And I think that that's a direct parallel to, for example, technology and cobalt mining and other things that are
Yes.
going on in the world right now that leads to these products like our phones and computers and all these things to be able to exist. And how does one extricate themselves from that, and any kind of boycott is almost it is not impossible, but as close to impossible as you can get, right? In this
Absolutely.
of
Absolutely.
living in the world, right? So when you talk about Unilever, it also makes me think about Nestle, and it makes me think about Apple, and it makes me think
Yes.
about all of these companies that have all these tendrils and tentacles that are so entrenched in our daily lives that even if you don't like what the company stands for, it is going to be a huge challenge for you to make
Right.
sure they don't get any of your
Right.
money.
Right. And it's important to understand that you are you are part of the fabric of the world, and that is also your strength, right? That it's that the illusion that we should go and be these isolated, atomized, separate people, that only goes to servicing the kind of capitalist fantasy that we live, as individuals, right? That is what that fantasy is. That fantasy is not like the fantasies of collectivity that makes you understand that no matter what you do, you're always relating to others. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go to the next image, and kind of continue the process of sort of sharing a bit about the work first, and then
Mhm.
I'll have some questions.
So this is a piece. I was reading the Confessions of Nat Turner. Now, again, to talk about something that is um, about the urge of the kind of powers that be to keep us all separate. One of the interesting things about Nat Turner's rebellion was that there was a concerted effort on the part of the newspapers to not publicize it, right? That they didn't want people to know that this thing had happened, because they knew that an idea like this would spread like wildfire. At the same time, um, there is also an interesting kind of relationship for me of uh, the ways in which that when Nat Turner had this fear of being beheaded, he had this fear of having his body paraded around in the streets, of his head put on a pike. He wrote about that in his confession, and I was interested in where that came from. Right, I'm interested in where does this very specific kind of fear come from, because this was a common practice, and it gets to the heart of something else that I'm interested in, which is the ways in which back in the day it was said that we were superstitious, that like all of the kind of colonial subjects, all the African Americans, we were superstitious people who were believed in magic and ghosts, and that they, the kind of powers that be, were scientific. But when you kind of get into the weeds of it all, you realize how much they too are doing all of this work that is, for lack of a better word, magical in its thinking, right? Why are you parading people's heads around on sticks? There's a magic that you're trying to involve in that. And I was interested in the idea that both Nat Turner understood that there was a magic involved in that and had a deep fear of that. Back to the idea of soap, what actually did happen with his body, this may be a little macabre, but it's true. Um, they turned his body into soap,
Yeah.
um, and that, if that doesn't have some kind of strange like significatory excess, but from like my years ago theory world, there's a like my like Lacanian background, like the significatory excess of that, of what does it mean to turn a man's body into soap? Who used that soap? Why? What kind of magic were you trying to deal with? um I'm fascinated with that. But so this is that kind of, these are the shallow waters that I'm interested in kind of investigating as a thinker, as an artist.
Wow. So the thing that makes me think about is that I've always felt that power is a kind of magic.
Hmm.
Um, because if you consider what it means to control other people's bodies and minds, it requires more than physical dominance.
Yeah.
It's a weird kind of sorcery in some
Speak
ways.
the truth, brother. Yeah, that's absolutely the truth. Yeah.
And it makes me think about um, so there were some slave owners in the Caribbean. It doesn't even matter where they were specifically, because the story is more about what they said and what they did. And they wrote a letter to their home country, which I believe,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in Europe. And
Mm-hmm.
again, the specifics, the geographies is not as important as the underpinning of the story. So these
Right.
white slave owners in the Caribbean wrote a letter to their home country, um, pleading for sympathy and help because they had about 200 slaves on their plantation, and they knew that the thin line between them being alive and not being alive was just one person in that group of slaves making the decision
Right.
that that was the day
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
that they were no longer going to be alive, right? And so even though they were getting an immense amount of wealth from their position as oppressors, they also were seeking sympathy and for their condition,
Right.
being surrounded by so many people who they were oppressing. And it's like a weird,
Right.
because they could always stop oppressing them, so
Yeah,
it's like a weird,
that's a choice that they didn't seem to understand that they could make, but absolutely right.
the option of just not doing it never
Right.
actually occurred to
Right.
them. So it's like, let's live in danger
Yeah. It's true.
Every day, wake up wondering, is this the day?
Right, right. And and
That
and there's a magic on both sides of that, right? Because there's a magic that they are employing to kind of keep the dreaming down of these 200 people who could kill them at any moment. And then there's a magic that they have to put on themselves to kind of
right,
allow themselves the both obliviousness and kind of like steady drumbeat of vileness that allows them to do what they're doing over and over and over again. Right.
right, right. And so that fascinates me. And then also you were talking about Nat Turner and how the media at the time was trying to like suppress what had happened there. In Haiti, for example, slave revolutions and enslaved peoples rebelling and killing their oppressors, is something that, obviously has happened. And it's interesting if you read the accounts of the people who showed up afterwards, you would think that the people who rose up for their own freedom, you would think that they just kind of came from outside and murdered these
Right.
people.
Right.
They wrote
Right.
about it in a way as if to say, "Oh my God, we can't believe how much violence was inflicted upon the enslavers by these barbarians, who, by the way, we had been enslaving for the past few
And who, by
generations."
the way, had been in our homes. And I think that that's
Right,
the other, this idea of like these are people who have been our intimates in so many ways, and that's interesting to me. Yeah, absolutely.
right, right. So let's go to the next image because I think we have two more.
Hmm. So this one is, I'm always interested in dual worlds and what it means to be in more than one world. In the Odyssey, there's a section called the Nikuya, which
Mm,
is a traditional thing that happens in a lot of epic poems from that time in geography, in which we go and talk to the land of the dead. So
mm,
in this image, I am thinking both about um, Rodin's The Burghers of Calais, which I'm borrowing some figures from, especially the figure with the one hand. And I'm also thinking about ballroom culture, both of which are in certain ways a relationship of the land of a relationship with the land of the dead. Ballroom culture having happened, at the height of the AIDS crisis in New York City, and there's always a conversation with death that's happening there. So I'm taking this idea of like our hyphen, the worlds that we inhabit, the world of wherever that hyphen lives between African and American, or between like the land of the living and the land of the dead. These are this kind of hyphenate life. This is something that we are very aware of, and I'm interested in that.
Let's go to the next image so that I can ask you a couple more questions before we end today's conversation.
Hmm. So this is a large quilt about Polyphemus. Polyphemus. There's a one big joke in the Odyssey. I love the Odyssey just because it is. When I was with all those kids in Munich, they'd all said to me that they were like they imagined themselves, as all young people do, to be like the first to have made this migration. Right? They all kids think that they're the first to do anything, and I was like, yo, little brothers, little sisters, man, people have been writing about this migration across the Mediterranean for generations. Let's look at the Odyssey together. So, looking at the Odyssey, there is this one joke in there in which Odysseus blinds the Cyclops, the giant Cyclops Polyphemus. And so cat's got one eye. Odysseus pokes out his eye. He can't see, and so he calls out in the darkness, and he says, "Who did this to me?" And Odysseus says, "Nobody." And then he screams, "Nobody's doing something to me!" And then all of the other Cyclopses are like, whatever. Then if nobody's doing something to you, it's a dumb joke. That being said, I was interested in the idea of what it means to be nobody, and how much nobody itself can be very effective. And in that, I'm also borrowing from the opening chapters of Invisible Man, which is where all the light bulbs motif comes from.
Right.
This idea of like, what does it mean to be nobody? So there's this way of like looking back at the historical records, the stories that we've been telling each other as humans for generations, and seeing the ways in which these are everyday stories that we all, these are mythic stories that we all need to look at, investigate, and find our own relationship to.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful. I have one final question for you. Maybe I can squeeze in two, but you travel a lot for your work, but where do you feel the most at home? Like, where is it
Oh
where you are
Lord.
now? But like, where in the world makes you feel the most at home?
I'll tell you two answers for that. I mean, there's always a way in which I'm like New York, because I'm from, like, I'm generations deep on this New York thing, and people ask oftentimes how I can travel with such kind of confidence and ease. I'm like, it's because I'm from New York. I was born in Queens. There were like more languages probably spoken in the hospital that I was born in than, most of the world, and that's true. But that may be a kind of that's a convenient answer. I think a truer answer is the place I'm most comfortable is in the dialogue of making.
Mm.
This idea of what does it mean to be a storyteller? What does it mean to be making things with other people? Because, you know, that is the one place that never leaves me. If I'm in if I'm in Kenya with metal workers outside Nairobi, if I'm, with doing digital kind of, I've been doing some AR stuff in Gurgaon in India, like, that dialogue of making, that place is always and will always be home.
Well, we're going to end on that note. I really want to thank
Uh,
you, Christopher. As you
Yo, man.
mentioned before, we could probably continue this conversation much longer, but I think we covered some wonderful ground here today. So thank you so much for your generosity. So I'm going to say
Brother,
our
it's good
final
to
word.
hear from it's good to hear from you, man. It's good to see you. I can't wait to talk to you again soon, man. Every time we talk, it's a gift. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, the Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt Center to expand its reach and further develop programs like Open Air. You can lend your support to the Gantt Center. Go to ganttcenter.org/donate. Also, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel for future programs and other video content updates. We want to thank you for joining us for another wonderful conversation. Christoper Myers' exhibition on view at the Gantt Center will be up until July 21st, so please check it out. We look forward to next month's open air. Everyone have a safe and wonderful evening. Good night.